Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a file that, on the surface, looks a little dry. It's titled Section 5, Expansion and Reform, and it covers the years 1864 to 1873.
Right, and if you just, glance at the headings, you see things like organization, institutions, publishing. It really sounds like you're about to read the minutes of a 19th century board meeting.
Exactly. But here's the thing, and this is why we do these deep dives. When you actually get into the details of what was happening in those 9 years, the stakes were just unbelievably high. This wasn't just a church filing paperwork.
No, not at all. It was more like a startup trying to survive its first few years while, the world around it was in chaos.
That's a perfect analogy because you have
Yeah.
to remember the context the source gives us. The Seventh-day Adventist Church had just formally organized in 1863. They finally had a name, a structure.
And then immediately, right away, they hit this massive wall. They had to figure out how to take this scattered group of believers and turn it into a real functional organization, one that could survive a war and then somehow expand.
So that's our mission today. We're going to unpack Section 5. We'll look at how this tiny group expanded geographically, how they built their institutions, and how they started to reform their doctrines and lifestyle.
And if I had to put one single theme on this whole deep dive, it would be infrastructure. This is the story of how they stopped just talking about ideas and started building the machine to carry those ideas.
We're talking bricks and mortar.
Bricks and mortar, yeah.
Yeah.
Schools, hospitals, publishing houses, moving from theology to, tangible things.
Okay, let's jump in. The timeline starts in 1864. Now, anyone who knows their American history knows that the early 1860s meant one thing:
The Civil War.
the Civil War.
Right. And for a brand new church, this was a huge, huge problem. They organized in 63, and the war is raging. And the source material points to a very specific obstacle they faced: the draft.
So it wasn't just the violence in general, it was the draft specifically.
Exactly. This was a real crisis of conscience.
Right.
You have this group of people who are, deeply committed to the Ten Commandments, specifically, thou shalt not kill.
Right.
And they also observe the Sabbath on Saturday. Military service in the 1860s, it didn't really offer accommodations for those beliefs. If you're drafted, you fight.
So they were completely stuck. If they refused to serve, they could be seen as traitors during a national crisis. But if they served, they'd be violating their own core beliefs.
It was an existential threat to the whole new organization, and the source notes a really critical victory for them here. In 1864, the United States government officially granted them noncombatant status.
That is a huge milestone. Today, we hear noncombatant, and it's, a standard option. But back then, for such a young, small group, that must have been a massive diplomatic achievement.
It was. It basically solved that crisis of conscience. It meant they could serve the country, often in hospitals or caring for freedmen, without having to bear arms. It allowed the organization to survive the war with its principles intact.
So they survived the Civil War. 1865 comes, the war ends. You'd think, okay, time to take a breath. Let's consolidate in Michigan.
But no. The source says the focus shifted immediately to the call to go west.
And we should probably clarify what West meant back then. We're not talking about, Illinois.
No, we are talking about the far west.
California,
the absolute frontier. And here's what's so interesting about this. It wasn't like a top-down strategic decision from headquarters. It started with a plea from just 14 members living out there.
Wait, 14, as in 1-4?
Just 14 people. The source actually calls it the Macedonian Call. These 14 people in California wrote a letter and basically said, hey, we're all alone out here. We need help. Send someone.
That's such a tiny number to justify a transcontinental mission in 1868. Sending someone to California back then wasn't like booking a flight. It was a long, dangerous journey.
It was, but they listened. At the 1868 General Conference session, they appointed 2 men to go, J. N. Loughborough and D.T. Bourdeau.
I just love that image. 2 guys packing their bags to cross a continent because 14 people asked them to. It feels so scrappy.
It was incredibly scrappy. But the work spread fast. The source mentions it moved into Western Canada too. But to really get the level of commitment here, you have to look at James and Ellen White.
They didn't just send people, did they? They went themselves.
They did. They visited the Pacific coast in 1872. But the source mentions one specific fact that really it stopped me. To support this work out west, James and Ellen White sold their home in Battle Creek.
They sold their house.
They sold their house and donated the money to the work in the West.
Wow. That's what you call skin in the game. I mean, literally, they didn't just approve a budget line item, they liquidated their biggest personal asset to fund the expansion.
It shows you just how vital they believed this was. And that money, that injection of capital, was critical. By 1874, just a couple of years after their visit, the first issue of the Signs of the Times was printing out west.
Which became a massive publication for them.
Huge. It was basically a second headquarters. And the source connects this to the modern day, noting that today, nearly one-third of the entire North American division membership lives in those two Western unions.
That is just a staggering return on investment. From selling one house and listening to 14 people.
It really is. A lesson in not despising small beginnings.
So they're expanding geographically. But at the exact same time, they're expanding their lifestyle. The section is titled Expansion and Reform, and health seems to be the big reform here. Why the sudden focus on health in the 1860s?
Well, the source is remarkably blunt about it. It says the pioneer leaders were in very poor health.
Okay, that happens. People get sick.
But listen to the reason it gives. It says they were in poor health largely due to ignorance.
Ignorance. Wow. That's a harsh word for a church history manual to use about its own founders.
It is, but it was probably accurate for the time. I mean, you have to remember, mid-19th century medicine was a mess. People were working themselves into the ground, eating terribly, not resting. The leaders were just burning out.
So this health reform wasn't just some nice theological add-on. It sounds like it was a survival mechanism.
Absolutely. If your leaders keep dying from exhaustion and preventable diseases, the movement collapses. So the reform started with information. In 1865, Ellen White released 6 pamphlets on health.
Reading material first.
Right. And then in 1866, they launched the church's first health journal, the Health Reformer. They were trying to educate people out of that ignorance.
But they didn't just stop at pamphlets and magazines. They went back to the bricks and mortar.
Precisely. It wasn't enough to just read about being healthy. They needed a place to practice it. So in 1866, they opened the Western Health Reform Institute.
Which is kind of a mouthful for a hospital name.
It is, which is probably why it later became world-renowned under a different name, the Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Ah, the sanitarium, of course. But here's my question. They just came out of a war. They're sending money and people to California. How on earth did they pay for a hospital in 1866?
It came back to the members. It was paid for by personal pledges. The source specifically points out that James White and a man named J.P. Kellogg each gave $500.
$500 in 1866? That was a fortune.
There's a massive amount of money back then. It was basically early crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And that investment kicked off what would become this huge global network. The source also mentions a Dr. Kate Lindsay.
Who was she?
She helped start a school of medicine at Battle Creek later on in 1883. So you see this clear progression from pamphlets to a magazine to a clinic to a world-famous sanitarium and then to a medical school.
They were building a whole self-sustaining ecosystem for health.
Exactly. And that ecosystem started to bleed over into other areas, which leads us perfectly into the next pillar from the source, education.
Right, because you can't really have a medical school without a focus on education. But the source says the early attempts at schools were pretty sporadic.
They were. It was mostly, individuals trying things. The source gives an example from 1853 where John Byington sponsored a school in New York, and his daughter Martha was the teacher.
But that's a local effort. If the Byington family moves, the school probably closes.
Exactly. It wasn't a system. The real shift to a formal denominational education system happens in this same time window, this 1864-1873 period.
So when does the first official school open?
The big turning point is 1872. And the location, Battle Creek, Michigan.
It always comes back to Battle Creek in this era, doesn't it?
It was the hub, for sure. But here's the connection that I think is just brilliant. The teacher for this first official school was a man named Goodloe H. Bell.
Goodloe Bell.
Yes. And the source describes him as a former patient of the Battle Creek Sanitarium.
No way. So the health institution was actually feeding the educational institution. The patient became the teacher.
That's exactly right. The systems were feeding each other. The sanitarium helps restore his health, and then he turns around and builds their school system.
That's an amazing connection. And what about the building? I'm guessing they didn't build a fancy new campus right away.
Not even close. The source says the school was housed in the building originally built for the printing press.
I love that resourcefulness. You've got the press building hosting the school, taught by a patient from the sanitarium. It's so interconnected.
It's the definition of a startup. You use what you have. And from those really humble beginnings, the source makes this incredible claim that today, the church operates more schools around the world than any other Protestant denomination.
That is just staggering when you think about it, starting with one guy in an old print shop.
It really is.
Yeah.
It shows you the power of building that infrastructure early on.
Okay, so we have the West, health, and education. But a church is also about people gathering. Let's talk about organizing the laity. The source mentions the revival of camp meetings.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting piece of sociology. Early Adventists, back before 1844, held camp meetings all the time. But the source says they stopped.
Why did they stop?
The text says it was due to public ridicule.
Ridicule.
Yes. After the Great Disappointment of 1844, the public mood was pretty hostile. They were mocked. So they kind of went underground, in a sense. They stopped having big public gatherings.
So what brought them back?
By 1868, so 5 years after they officially organized, they felt it was time. They held the first official Seventh-day Adventist camp meeting on a farm in Michigan.
They got their confidence back.
They did. And the turnout was pretty shocking. 2,000 attendees.
2,000 people in 1868.
Yep. And it just exploded from there. The source notes that by 1878, just 10 years later, a camp meeting near Boston attracted 20,000 people.
That's like a small city just popping up in a field.
It shows you there was this hunger for that kind of gathering. It wasn't just about local worship anymore. It was about being part of something bigger.
And while the adults were gathering at these huge camp meetings, the source talks about something happening for the weekly instruction of members. Sabbath school.
And here we see our friend, Goodloe H. Bell again.
The patient turned teacher. He was a busy guy.
The source calls him the born teacher.
Yeah.
Now, James White had written the first lessons way back in 1852. But in this era of reform, they decided to systematize it.
What does that mean, to systematize it?
It means moving from just, reading an article to having a structured curriculum. In 1869, G.H. Bell prepared 2 specific series of lessons. Then in 1870, they added a programming format. It became a real institution within the church.
But the source makes a really big connection here that I wasn't expecting. I usually think of Sabbath school as, study time. But the text connects it directly to global missions.
This is one of the most important takeaways in this whole section. Sabbath school became the engine for funding missions. The very first Sabbath school gifts were sent to Australia in 1885 and then Africa in 1887.
So it was a fundraising network.
A massive one, built on small donations from thousands of people. The source even mentions they used these funds to send the ship Pitcairn to the South Pacific.
Pitcairn. Isn't that the island from the Mutiny on the Bounty?
That's the one. And here's a wild piece of trivia from the source. It notes that the population of Pitcairn Island today is entirely Seventh-day Adventist.
The whole island.
The whole island. And that's a direct result of the Sabbath school offerings that funded that ship. So when you see the statistic for the year 2000, over 14.5 million Sabbath school members, you're not just looking at students. You're looking at a global network that powers the church's expansion.
It's amazing how these things that seem like just administrative details, writing some lessons, organizing a meeting, have these massive downstream effects.
It's the power of organization. Which brings us to the last piece of this puzzle in Section 5, the literature and tract societies.
We mentioned the signs of the times earlier, but this is more about distribution, isn't it?
Correct. It's one thing to print a paper. It's another thing to get it into people's hands. The source introduces the Vigilant Missionary Society.
That sounds very serious. Vigilant.
It was formed in 1869, and the source identifies a key leader here, Stephen N. Haskell. He was the one who really saw the potential for wide literature distribution.
So not just printing it, but building a system to move it.
Exactly. He organized what became known as tract and missionary societies. Then in 1873, the General Conference made it official and formed a missionary society.
And the source traces the lineage of this department, right? It evolved over time.
It did. The source traces it from there to the lay activity department, then personal ministries, but it also birthed the publishing department, the whole Cole Porter ministry, and the Adventist book centers.
So every ABC store today can trace its roots right back to Stephen Haskell and the Vigilant Missionary Society in 1869.
It's all connected. The infrastructure they laid down in this one decade, 1864 to 1873, is basically the blueprint for the modern church.
It's really a whirlwind when you recap it all. I mean, think about it. You've got the church getting non-combatant status during a war. You have the expansion to California. You have the first sanitarium, the first official school.
The restart of camp meetings, the organization of Sabbath school, the tract societies, all in less than 10 years. It's incredible.
It really is.
And I think what's so fascinating is the shift in mindset it represents. You have to remember, before this, the movement was very much focused on the immediate second coming.
Right. They thought the world could end at any moment.
Exactly. So why would you build schools? Why build a hospital? But this decade represents this realization that, occupy till I come means you have to build things. It means structure. It means looking after the health of your leaders and the education of your kids.
It's a move from abstract theology to very practical application.
Precisely. They built the physical and organizational structures that allowed the theology to travel. Without the sanitarium, the health message is just a theory. Without the press and the tract societies, the doctrine stays stuck in Battle Creek.
And without the noncombatant status, the whole organization might have been crushed by the war before it even got started.
Correct. It was a decade of first survival and then just aggressive foundation laying.
There's one thing from this source that just keeps sticking in my mind. We touched on it, but I want to circle back. That comment about the pioneers being in very poor health due to ignorance.
It's a really striking admission, isn't it?
It is, and it makes you wonder, and this is something for you, the listener, to really think about, how might the history of this whole movement have been different if they hadn't paused to address the physical well-being of their leaders right alongside their theological goals?
That's a profound question. Because if your leaders are burning out or dying young, the movement dies with them. The health reform wasn't just a side project. It was likely a survival mechanism for the leadership itself. It's a reminder that you can't build a spiritual movement if the physical people carrying it are just falling apart.
It adds such a layer of humanity to the story. These weren't superheroes. They were just people trying to figure out how to live and work electively.
And doing it while selling their own homes to fund the mission.
Exactly. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into expansion and reform. We hope you have a clearer picture of just how much those years from 1864 to 1873 really shaped the church we see today.
It's always worth looking back to see how the foundation was poured.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.